My best friend says he can talk to crows. George was always a little weird. He was a small, pale, dishwater blonde, whose love of black vintage clothing made him look like a cross between a vampire and a funeral usher. He would talk, and sometimes sing, to himself in public. He spent most of his time reading, drawing fantasy creatures in his many sketchbooks, and taking long walks around town. But the weirdest thing about him was that he said he could talk to crows. We met in the 3rd grade. I was the new girl in town, sent from Boston to live with my grandparents while my parents slogged through their messy divorce. I first saw him at recess, a scrawny blonde boy dressed in black, sitting in an empty field, surrounded by crows. While the other kids hollered and laughed and ran around the playground, this kid was whispering to no one. "What are you doing?" I asked him. "Talking to the crows," he said, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. I crossed my arms and glared at him. "You can't talk to crows." He turned his head around to look at me. "Most people can't. But I can." "How do you do that?" The boy smiled, oblivious to my annoyance. Crows are very smart. Scientists say they have their own language. They have jokes and different names for each other. I squinted at the half-dozen blackbirds milling around the boy. They didn't look that smart to me. I pointed at one. "What's that one saying?" "That's Percival. He's sulking because Diana Dash," he gestured to another crow, "ate the caterpillar he wanted." Either this kid was playing an elaborate joke, or he was absolutely cuckoo. "And that one?" I asked. "That's Enoch. He's an elder." The boy cocked his head slightly. He had the palest blue eyes I'd ever seen, so pale they were almost white. "He's sizing you up. Trying to see if you're a friend or a foe." Sure enough, Enoch was staring at me, his head cocked in a manner eerily similar to the boy's. I've rarely been able to discern the slightest emotion from a crow's beady black eyes, but in that moment I could see it. Curiosity. Suspicion. "So what, he's like the leader of the flock?" "Not flock. A murder." "What?" "A group of crows is called a murder." Whether he was cuckoo or not, this boy was proving to be the most interesting person in this boring little town. I sat down on the grass next to him. "My name's Maria," I said. And there I stayed. My parents were more interested in dragging out their divorce proceedings than coming back for their own kid, so my temporary stay with my grandparents became permanent. I never quite felt like I belonged anywhere. I never adjusted to leading the city for a small town. I felt restless, like everything around me was slow and dull and hazy. I was a half-Mexican girl living in a mostly white town with my white grandparents. I was foreign enough to elicit stares from the locals, but too American to know how to speak Spanish. I was able to make a few friends, eventually. But George and I, always the odd kids out, became the closest. I learned pretty quickly that George spent most of his time alone. His parents were social climbers, eager to pretend their weirdo son didn't exist. Teachers didn't like him much. He was smart, but his grades were erratic. And he never fit in with the other kids. He was too cheerful for the goths, too quiet for the theater kids, too technologically inept for the geeks and nerds. Aside from me, his only companions were the crows. He knew every one of the dozens of crows that lived in our town, their names, origins, likes and dislikes. He gave them treats like peanuts and hard-boiled eggs. They left him gifts, usually shiny things like coins and bottle caps. When Enoch died, George, the other crows, and I held a funeral where George sobbed for hours. After that, the crows took to following him around whenever he went outdoors. Whenever he went indoors, the crows would gather round the windows, pecking and cawing to get his attention. "Why are they doing that?" my grandma asked nervously. George was over for dinner and she noticed a few crows pecking at the dining room window. Crows can remember human faces, George said matter-of-factly. They remember humans who are friends to them and treat them like members of the group. Can they remember the humans who are jerks to them? My grandpa joked. Yes, they can. They'll tell the other crows about them and coordinate an attack. Grandpa started to laugh, but after seeing George's serious expression he fell silent. Shortly after that I noticed the crows following me around. Not nearly as many as followed George, and not nearly as often. But there were sometimes a few trailing after me when I went outside. When I told George about it his face split into a smile. They know you're my friend, he said. They consider you part of the murder now. It was a little unnerving, being tailed by little black birds everywhere I went, but I trusted George. If he thought being followed was a good thing, then he was probably right. There's only one event, from before things got so messed up, that stands out in my mind. It was right after I'd gotten my driver's license and inherited my grandma's ancient blue sedan. I was driving into town when I saw George. Now, it wasn't unusual to see him walking along local roads. But this time, he was standing along the highway in that thin stretch of grass between the forest and the asphalt, and he was staring at the ground. I pulled over and stepped out of my car to make sure he was okay. He didn't even look up. "Hi, Maria," he said blandly. "You're just in time for the feast." Before I could reply, I saw what he was looking at. It was a deer that had been hit by a car. It lay on its side, in a pool of its own blood. Its abdomen was slashed open, and its guts spilled out onto the grass. And there were the crows, tearing out pieces of its flesh, sipping the congealing blood, slurping up its intestines. Worse still, the deer was still alive. What remained of its abdomen moved up and down in shallow, rapid breaths. Its eyes blinked rapidly. Its head moved groggily, snorting and whimpering as it lay there, being eaten alive. I stared and stared, wishing I could put the deer out of its misery, but too afraid to deal the killing blow. I realized George had been holding something. It was a baby crow with all white feathers. He was feeding it a piece of the deer's flesh, staining the crow's pink beak red. "This is Lux," he explained. "The other crows rejected her because of how she looks. So I'm taking care of her. And maybe one day, I can integrate her into the murder." I nodded blankly, backed into my car, and drove away. It was the only truly freaky incident that occurred before the real nightmare. At the time, I put it out of my mind. Crows are scavengers, after all. It was just the circle of life. The trouble truly began when George started dating Kate. They were apparently introduced at some rich people function and hit it off right away. I seemed to be the only person who thought it was creepy that a 22-year-old was dating a high schooler. The average response to my concerns was, "He'll be 18 in a few months, anyway." Beyond that, they had nothing in common. Kate's family, I'll call them the Oxfords, were old-money New Englanders, the sort that brag about their ancestors coming over on the Mayflower. The Oxfords owned half the businesses in town, which meant we had to treat them like royalty. Kate wasn't outwardly mean, but she was shallow, bossy, and entitled. Not that George cared. He was head over heels, absolutely smitten. George had never had a girlfriend before. Now the prettiest, richest, most popular woman in town wanted him for herself. Everyone constantly talked about how lucky he was. "Kate's such an amazing catch. She'll straighten him out in no time. It'll be a fairy tale wedding. He won't have to work a day in his life." By graduation, George was spending almost all of his spare time with Kate. I guess I shouldn't have been surprised when I received their wedding invitation at the end of the summer. I didn't enjoy the wedding. It looked like it was curated for Kate's Pinterest account, and Kate made it pretty clear that she didn't want me there. But George seemed happy, and despite my misgivings, I came to support him. Although we had nice weather, Kate opted for an indoor wedding. I heard her tell a bridesmaid it was because those stupid birds won't leave us alone. I took a gap year, waiting tables at a local restaurant to raise money for college. After the wedding, I began to see George less and less. Every time I called him, he had a different reason for why he couldn't hang out. He wasn't feeling well, he and Kate were going on vacation, he was seeing his parents. He didn't go for walks anymore either. By winter, I mostly saw him whenever he stopped by the liquor store next to the restaurant. These liquor store runs were becoming alarmingly frequent. I found excuses to drive by his house. George and Kate had moved into one of the Oxford's many houses, a Victorian mansion at the very edge of town, about a mile away from the nearest neighbor. It was what rich people called rustic and the rest of us called rundown. Its whitewash and green shutters were peeling. Its driveway, more gravel than pavement, seemed ill-suited for Kate's shiny new Lexus. The house was surrounded by thin strips of yard before giving way to the woods. But what struck me most of all was that every time I went there were dozens of crows surrounding the house. They flew onto the roof and pecked the dirt in the front yard. They knocked on the windows and perched in the surrounding trees. Sometimes their cawing was unbearably loud, but most of the time they were just silent, as if they were watching, waiting. I could only assume they were waiting for George. Occasionally I would see him staring out the window, with a glass of wine in his hand and a blank expression on his face. Despite his many friends waiting for him outside, and despite me waving to him from my car window, he would never come out. As winter gave way to a damp and chilly spring, I realized I had to do something. The next time I saw George at the liquor store, I ran out of the restaurant to see him. He didn't look good at all. His fair skin had a sickly grayish tinge. He had lost weight, his figure barely visible under his baggy sweatshirt. His eyes had an empty, unfocused look, and his breath reeked of wine. He swayed slightly when he walked, and hardly seemed to notice the crows gathering around him. I'll admit I initially ambushed him with questions. Are you okay? Are you sick? Where have you been? He had trouble keeping up, only mumbling short replies. But when I asked him, why are you avoiding me, he went quiet and looked away. George? No answer. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to dash. I'm not allowed to have female friends, he blurted. Not allowed? I sputtered. Says who? Kate. It's not your fault, Maria. You've been great. But I've been a bad husband, and Kate wanted to set boundaries. I just need some more time, she'll come around. This is all my fault. I couldn't believe this. So Kate was the problem. Something was wrong. Something was deeply, terribly, dangerously wrong. I have to go, he said. If she finds out I talked to you, dash. Don't! I cried. George flinched, so I softened my tone. We have to talk more. When can I see you again? He thought for a moment. The park. 6 p.m. tomorrow. Where no one can see us. Deal. Just be safe, George. Look out for yourself. Please. George didn't reply, just stumbled down the street with his bottles of wine and a line of crows trailing behind him. The next evening I waited for George at a bench in the far corner of the park. The sun was setting rapidly, painting the two of us in blazing oranges, and later velvety blues. George looked better at least, he was steady on his feet. He wore a huge pair of sunglasses in spite of the fading light. The crows gathered around us. I couldn't tell if they were listening in, or keeping watch. The white crow found her way to the bench and snuggled into George's arms, where he gave her gentle head scratches. Lux is doing so well now, he said. The other crows just made her an elder. I'm so proud of her. I tried to make small talk. Had he read any books lately? Had he made any cool drawings? Found any new vintage clothes? No, and no. As the sun sank lower in the sky, I asked him why he kept his sunglasses on. He hesitated for a minute, then said, Please don't freak out. He removed the sunglasses to reveal a massive bruise. It was stark against his pale skin, a sickly purple spreading across the left side of his face and around one reddened eye. Jesus Christ. What happened to you? It's all my fault, he mumbled. One of Kate's friends saw us together. Kate was crying and so upset, she didn't mean this. And she won't do it again. She promised. Bullshit. I snapped. Kate's got you trapped in that old mansion. And now she's hurting you. She'll find a reason to do it again, no matter what. A line of tears was emerging from his bad eye and tracing a path down his mottled cheek. I don't know what to do. I took his cold hand in mine. You have to leave. As soon as you can. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking out at the dozens of crows surrounding us. I can't. She'll come after me. You don't know what sort of connections the Oxfords have. I'll help you. You just have to try. He sniffled. She'll find me and kill me. Please. I insisted. How could I make him see? I gestured outwards. Ask the crows. Do they want you to leave, Kate? George was silent for a few minutes. He was cocking his head, listening. I strained to follow their silent conversation, but I couldn't understand anything. The crow's black eyes were as cold and empty as ever. Lux looked up at George and croaked softly. Yes, George said, they say I should leave. I did everything I could to help George. I told my grandparents everything. They believed me, but were too scared of the Oxfords to help. I tried to tell George's parents, but they hung up on me mid-sentence. They saw George's marriage as their ticket to high society and wouldn't do anything to jeopardize it. I even called the local police. After I could get the deputy who answered to stop laughing and hand the phone over, the chief scolded me for spreading baseless rumors about a good girl from a good family. In the end, it was up to myself and George. Our plan was simple. We'd wait for when Kate was out of the house. George would throw a few clothes and some valuables in a backpack and sneak out through the back door. I would wait for him, parked about 300 feet away. I couldn't risk driving up to his house. George said the maid was instructed to phone Kate whenever my car drove past. Once George got into my car, we'd drive out of town, to Boston or even further. One evening Kate went out to have dinner with her parents. George stayed behind, claiming illness. I drove my crappy blue sedan to our agreed-upon spot and sat on the hood waiting for George to arrive. It was one of those evenings that was too cloudy for a proper sunset. Instead, the sky shifted from white to dark gray, and the shadows deepened. It was still early spring, and my sweatshirt did little to shield me from the wind. A handful of crows perched on my car, as if they were waiting for George, too. My stomach was tying itself into knots. I found myself jumping at the rustling branches and scuttling animals. The woods loomed all around me, dark branches stretching miles high and creeping towards my tiny little car. It wasn't just the fear of being caught that was winding me up. I mean, what the hell was I doing? Here I was, about to throw away everything I'd ever known, my grandparents, my job, college, to run off with some guy. But George wasn't just some guy. This was the guy with the sweet smile, who was kind to everyone he met, no matter how nasty they were in return. Who refused to be frightened by death and decay, who loved mushrooms and bones the same way others loved songbirds and flowers. He could look at a deer in its death throes without flinching. He was the guy who could talk to crows. And to think about him now, sickly, bruised, drunk and alone, was enough to break my heart right in two. How was it that every time I saw him looking out the manor window, I failed to see the prison bars? He was dying of abuse and loneliness, and only I could save him. He was my best friend, perhaps my only true friend. He would have done the same for me. George arrived with his backpack and a murder of crows in tow. His skin was ghostly white, the yellow splotch of his fading bruise was very noticeable. He was practically shaking with nerves. "Are you okay, George?" "Terrified, but okay," he stammered. I tried to smile, but failed miserably. "So am I. Let's go." Before either of us could get into my car, we were interrupted by the sound of screeching tires. A shiny Lexus swerved towards us, barely missing my car and sending crows scattering. From the open window we could hear an enraged shriek. Kate had come home early. In the few seconds Kate stayed in the driver's seat, screaming obscenities at us, I came to a chilling realization. How it must have looked to jealous Kate, leaving home for a few hours only to find her unfaithful husband, backpack in hand, about to get into the car of his female friend. I almost felt sorry for her. My sympathy evaporated when her designer handbag came flying out the window. It struck George on the forehead, sending his small frame crumpling to the ground. Kate threw open the door and launched herself at George. She straddled him, pinning him to the ground as she rained blows on his face and arms. I could make out a few words: cheating bastard, Mexican whore, how could you do this to me, mixed with George's sobs and wailed apologies. I threw myself at Kate, hoping to pull her off, and was met with an elbow to the face. I stumbled backwards, blood pouring out of my crushed nose. Kate was still beating George. His sobs were getting quieter and weaker, while her screams were unrelenting. Her face was unrecognizable, with a snarling open mouth and rolling eyes. Gone was the poised heiress with the polished car and fancy handbag. This was the true Kate, a wild animal, a howling demon, the monster who had kept George locked away. She would kill him. If not now, then later, after she had dragged him away. I wanted to do something, anything, but I lay frozen on the pavement. The blood from my nose was running down my throat, and the metallic taste gave me the powerful urge to vomit. Pain was pulsing through my face and spreading outwards with each heartbeat. Then I saw them. The crows. Dozens. Hundreds. More than I ever thought lived in this forest. They flew in a circle, their black bodies stark against the dark gray sky. Their calls grew louder and louder. And they were getting closer, spiraling towards the three of us, centering us in the eye of a tornado. A flash of white dashed into the center of the circle. Lux! She landed on Kate's shoulder and began pecking at her face. Kate tried to shake her off, but it didn't work. Lux's pecking turned to jabbing, which turned to stabbing. Kate stood up and tried to pull Lux off, but that only made things easier for Lux. She sank her pink beak into Kate's eye, impervious to her screams. The other crows soon descended on Kate, tearing the flesh away from her face, her neck, her hands. One crow ripped out chunks of her hair. Another tore out her fingernails, one by one. Kate's screams became blood-curdling. Help me! George! Help me! But the cawing became even louder, so deafening I had to cover my ears. The crows drowned her out completely. Before long, I couldn't see Kate anymore, just a writhing mass of blackbirds. George had gotten to his feet. I could tell from his slack expression that this was beyond his control. His eyes were so pale and so wide, I could see the swirling circle of crows reflected in each of them. I grabbed his hand. George! He stood there motionless, mouth open. Watching them. I pulled harder. We have to go. Now. That shook him out of it. We didn't stop, not even to pick up George's bag. We ran to my car and slammed the doors shut. I floored the gas pedal, drove as fast as the old car would allow, didn't stop until we were well into town and the cars were too far away to hear. We pulled into a parking lot and sat in silence for a few minutes, trying to catch our breath. Then we called 911. I never got to see what was left of Kate after the crows were done with her. George and I spent the night in the hospital, and the Oxfords held a closed casket funeral. The most I learned came from overhearing my grandpa talking to his friend on the police force. According to him, the only way the police recognized Kate was from her driver's license. They found it in a designer handbag lying on the road beside her. The local paper reported Kate's death as a possible bear attack, but word got around. Everyone knew it was George's crows. After George was released from the hospital, he spent the night with me and my grandparents. Neither of us could sleep, so we stayed up late talking. Around midnight, Lux started pecking at the window, holding a gift in her mouth. I should have been more freaked out about seeing a crow again, but I somehow knew that neither she nor any other crow would hurt me. George opened the window and greeted Lux with a smile. Her white feathers were still reddish-brown, from blood hadn't quite washed off. In her mouth was a human finger. It was missing a fingernail, but it wore a very familiar wedding ring. George thanked Lux and slipped the finger into his pocket. When he turned to me, his pale blue eyes had regained some of their past brightness, his smile warmer despite his bruised face. Perhaps he took the gift as a sign of the crow's true devotion. Or perhaps he could finally believe that Kate was truly dead. Either way, I was glad to have him back. I never asked George what he did with the gift. I cared about him a lot, but there were some things I didn't and still don't want to know. That was over a year ago. George and I are both going to college in Boston. I live in an apartment near campus, but George chooses to commute. The people in town still avoid him, but for different reasons. People cross the street if they see him coming. Waiters frantically apologize for the slightest mistakes. If a little kid tries to approach him, a parent will quickly pull them away. Maybe it's not him they're scared of, but the crows. They still follow him everywhere. Whenever I visit town, they follow me, too. I don't mind. Oddly enough, I feel safer with them around. Sometimes I ask George why he doesn't move away. Escape the Oxfords who shun him, the close-minded neighbors who fear him. Start over somewhere new. But he always refuses. He doesn't want to leave the crows behind. The devil of Laurel Branch. When I was a young girl, my dad always told me about the time when he was walking home on a late summer evening. The sun had just went down behind the mountain, blanketing the whole holler in darkness. This was not your typical darkness, but a darkness that was deep enough to feel. The type that made you feel like you were being suffocated. He was walking home with his father from his Aunt B.A.'s house. She always cooked Sunday dinner for the whole holler. Family or not, you were invited if you lived on Laurel Branch. You were considered family, even if you came from different blood. You were blood-bound by the branch. Every Sunday was filled with the laughter of his uncles and great-uncles as they sat together, huddled in the backyard shed. Cigarette smoke made the air hazy as their jokes lingered in it longer than they should. Sometimes, they would pass around a mason jar of shine from Old Opossum from the head of the holler. He wasn't kin, but he was family, like I said. The laughter wasn't the only sounds. It was sometimes drowned out by the angelic singing of Aunt B as she made cornbread with her daughter in the kitchen. Sometimes, as my dad played with the other kids, they couldn't keep themselves from running in the kitchen and pulling on Aunt B.'s apron for a quick crumble of the bread before supper. The scent that wafted through the open kitchen window was too enticing for them to ignore. This night was just like those nights that I described. Nothing out of the ordinary, except my dad's mama stayed at home to nurse his sister who had a cold. My dad and his father were not going to miss the mess of fresh squash that Aunt B was frying that night. His mama told them to go on. There wasn't nothing they could do. They'd just be bothering his sister coming in and out of the house. They'd just finished up listening to Great Uncle William's last story of the night. It of course ended in some dirty joke that caused him to laugh great big and throw back his knee. My dad was around 15 at this time, and this was the first time he was allowed to spend more than a minute in the shed. Most of the time, he was shooed out by a cigarette-gripped hand and told to go watch his cousins and sister. This time, he was welcomed. He even been allowed to get a tiny sup of the shine that Old Opossum had just made. He was walking on air. He never felt so grown up before. His father gave one more wave to his sister and brother-in-law as they began the quarter-mile walk down to the home place. His father was the one to keep the old home place after the grandparents moved in with Aunt B to get extra care. They believed it should go to the eldest male, and he took it. He took good care of it too. The little white house stayed spick and span and the yard immaculate. As they walked, his dad loaded him down with the leftovers covered in tinfoil that Aunt B had insisted they take to his mama and sister. He held the warm foil close to his chest as they went further and further into the belly of the holler. The home place was at the end of the holler, while BA's was 2 houses down from the top. In between was a thick patch of forest so dense that you couldn't see a star in the sky past the leaves. There was a branch that ran next to the road all the way down the holler that contained a giant boulder on its bank that they called Rabbit Rock. My dad had always called it Rabbit Rock, and his father did too. That's what that middle ground area was to them. His dad cut through the now pitch-black darkness by lighting up a hand-rolled cigarette. "Shoo, I'm stuffed," he said through the cigarette between his lips. "Me too," my dad replied. "Now don't be telling your mama that I let ye come in the shed for some moonshine, ye hear?" he said as he let out a long breath of smoke. The only thing visible to him was the cherry of his cigarette glowing orange in the deep darkness. "I won't." "Better not, son." He lovingly slapped his shoulder and gave it a hearty squeeze. My dad felt like a man. He felt like he was growing up, and his father knew it. They could connect on a different level now. Something new. They both continued walking in a comfortable silence that was filled with katydids singing their summer song. The darkness was different tonight. The past few nights had been clear of clouds, so the light of the moon could cast a low glow that would slightly penetrate through the trees. This night was clouded, and no light could reach. It was as if an invisible dome that deflected light was placed over the holler, cutting them off from the light of the moon forever. My dad noticed this darkness as they slowly walked into the trees. It seemed to creep up on them like a slow sickness, kind of like the one his sister had right now. He suddenly lost any manliness that he had gained that night. This darkness made him a boy again. A boy who unspokenly walked a bit closer to his father. It felt significantly lonely walking being just the two of them. He was used to his mama and sister walking slightly behind them. Tonight the only thing behind him was the crawling sensation on his back that signaled something might be following him. They trekked deeper into the wooded area, their boots kicking up dust on the dirt road. The further they went, the darker it got. It was to the point that they couldn't see their hand in front of their own faces. The only thing keeping them from running off the road was the familiar feel of the dirt road under their boots. "I'm gonna go out in the tater patch tomorrow to do some weeding and to keep an eye on those tater bugs. They've been eating all over them plants," his dad said, breaking the silence. He puffed on his cigarette, the only light around, shining like a lightning bug. Speaking of lightning bugs, there weren't any. That was odd, and the deeper they went, the less they heard of the katydids and their constant buzz. It was actually gone now. This made the chill climb higher up my daddy's spine. No light from the lightning bugs and no buzz from the katydids made the forest seem dark and devoid of all life. "I'll come help ye," my dad replied, desperate for any noise. His father hummed as he continued to puff on his cigarette. "What happened to them katydids?" he asked, not able to hide his nervousness. "They probably went to sleep, I guess. Your granddaddy used to say that a devil was passing through when it gets quiet like this. You think that's true?" My dad immediately regretted saying this. He knew his father would never let him back in the shed since he believed in tall tales. "Nah. Not unless the devil is a bobcat. That's one thing that can make it this quiet." They continued to walk, but my dad kept it crawling on his back, convinced a bobcat was silently stalking them from behind. He would glance over his shoulder once in a while, but that didn't help any. It was so dark it looked like staring into an oil pit. Thick. Dark. Nothing. Not even a shadow could be cast. They walked in their new silence. A silence that was too quiet and uncomfortable. Suddenly, my dad's darkness was disturbed by a wall. No, not a wall, it was warm, hairy, and filthy. He had run face first into something moving, no walking, the opposite direction. The feeling of matted fur, or maybe even hair, remained on his skin for far too long after losing contact. The smell was the worst, however. It assaulted his nostrils with a pungent odor, a cross between feces and rotten eggs. HMPHH. It grumbled as it hit my dad. It seemed just as surprised as he did. The tin foil leftovers of squash, beans, chicken livers, and cornbread crushed between them, letting a bit fall to the ground. In the blackness, his father was unsure of what happened, but felt the hair and smelled the stench of the thing brush past. This was enough to show him how much danger they had literally run into. This was no animal or human he had ever encountered before. Neither my dad or his had stopped walking during the whole ordeal. The only time they stopped was initial contact. Fear had propelled them both forward. The thing slid by and stopped at the dropped leftovers. It began eating with sickening and obscene noises. Both of them picked up their pace. What dash my dad was cut off by his father saying, "SHH. Keep walking." He did as he was told. He held the crumpled leftovers to his chest, the warm juices from the squash and beans seeping into his shirt. They both unspokenly increased their pace, almost to a light jog. They didn't want to draw any more attention to them since it was occupied. They got about 50 feet before they heard its slamming footsteps in the dirt behind them. It was coming towards them. "Drop some leftovers behind you," his dad urged. "What?" "Just do it." He did as he was told, once again, and threw a couple pieces of chicken behind him. The footsteps stopped and it began its stomach-churning eating again. They picked up their pace again and kept going down the road. They had almost made it through the wooded area and past Rabbit Rock. Another 50 feet had passed before they heard it running with an urgency. It sounded human. Like 2 feet rushing upon them. Like someone trying to attack. "More!" his dad yelled. He threw more chicken and some squash. His arm burned from how hard he threw, hoping to backtrack the beast. More ripping, tearing, and sucking filled their ears from behind. What was this thing? They were at the edge of the forest, almost out of the belly of the beast, they hoped. They could hear it smack its lips and grunt as it finished its last piece. "More! Before it can catch up," his father urged again as they burst from out of the woods. He fumbled with the foil and grabbed a handful of the mush that it had become. He stopped and slung it as far as he could. This time, with the little light that the uncovered night sky provided, he could see its eyes glow yellow as it stared into his. The eyes jumped from the ground about 7 or 8 feet up as it began to sprint towards the leftovers. My dad felt a primal fear that only his most ancient ancestors could have felt as he yelled, "Run!" They both ran as hard as they could, their boots creating clouds of dust behind them. He had never seen his father run, let alone like this. Heck, he had never seen him scared, but this was something that could scare the hardest and coldest of men. They ran until they saw the low glow of their porch light. My dad threw bits and pieces of the leftovers as they ran, the beast running and stopping, running and stopping. The sound. The smell. Its eyes. Neither of them could stop thinking of it. Finally, they both crossed the threshold and up to the porch. They erupted inside and slammed the wooden door behind them. His mama stood up quickly from her rocking chair. "What in the daylights is going on?" she yelled, a horrified look on her face. "There's some kind of man or animal or something after us," his dad said breathlessly, his unlit cigarette butt still in between his lips. "What are you talking?" His mama was cut off by a loud growl outside. It was like a cross between an animal's guttural groan and a wild man's scream. Everyone looked towards the door. My dad felt his heartbeat quicken and he held the smashed plate of food to his chest. "Mama," he whispered. That's when they heard it begin clawing and scratching at the foundation of the house. It began ripping and tearing the wood like the way its mouth destroyed the leftovers. "Mama," he yelled, fear engulfing him completely. He didn't care if this wasn't how a man should act. He was a boy and he would stay that way if it meant being brave in the face of things like this. His parents both looked at each other terrified. He'd never seen an emotion like this on their faces. He didn't know what scared him more, the beast or their faces. His mama ran to the back and grabbed his groggy sister into her arms and came back to put him to her chest. "Joseph! Kill that thing!" she yelled at his dad. "My little gun won't do a thing to it if it's ripping the house apart." It broke through the foundation and crawled under their floorboards. Beneath them, they could see the boards begin to lift and bend. Everyone was silent as they watched it hunt for food, sniffing loudly like a wild dog. Its stink seeped through the cracks of the floor along with its long, stiff hair. It stuck through the cracks like a porcupine's quills. They watched in horror as the weak boards were the only thing between them and it. "What do we do?" His mama yelled at their dad. "I don't know." "Get your gun," she screamed. His father ran to the bedroom and returned with his shotgun in his shaking hands. "Shoot it!" my dad screamed. He fired towards it, firing a hole through the floor. The beast let out an inhuman scream. His sister covered her ears and began to sob. His father fired again, another shriek erupting from beneath the floorboards. The beast began to slam itself into the floorboards repeatedly, its hair shooting through and its smell getting worse. Again, his mama screamed. He fired one final time. The beast bellowed in pain once more before it turned and scrambled out the way it came in, crying the whole way. My dad and his family stood there for quite a while, looking at the splintered floorboards, the bullet holes, wondering what just occurred in front of them. They had no words. They had no explanation. They just had fear. A fear far greater than anything they'd ever felt before. It was months before they were outside after dark again. They didn't even go to Aunt B.A.'s for at least a month. They were too afraid to go past Rabbit Rock into those woods. They couldn't risk another encounter with that thing. They inspected the prints outside their house the next day, but all that was there were boot prints. 3 sets of boot prints. Each one of their beliefs were altered that night. They never believed in monsters, devils, or haints, but that encounter solidified it for all of them. Everyone they told thought they just had a run-in with a bear and it was too dark to see, but they all knew this was far from a bear, bobcat, or any mountain animal they were used to. From that point on, they had a newfound respect for the forest, the mountain, and the nighttime. They knew they didn't belong out past dusk. Only creatures like that did. I work for a secret corporation cleaning up crime scenes. I met a dark god. I've tried to see Victor as often as possible. He still had his bad days when he lashed out at the staff. Recently when I called to ask to visit, the staff told me he had tried to fold an attendant like a paper crane. So, I skipped going over that day. My money problems were stressing me out. There was simply not enough to go around for my rent and Victor's care. I think once he recovered enough to make his own choices, he wouldn't want me putting my life at risk for him. Because I was human, the corporation put me on easy, mostly harmless tasks. And I had almost been killed on the last one. I couldn't imagine what kind of job they would force him into facing. A call came in for a scene cleanup. This time they said an agent they had sent ahead of time to clear the building, and he was the one who requested the cleanup. I packed up my supplies wondering what I would be walking into because there hadn't been that many details. I had a feeling it was a busy day for the corporation. I was transported to a large rundown warehouse in the middle of nowhere without much explanation. I was told to collect the bodies inside and the agent on the scene would deal with transporting them elsewhere. I would then clean the entire building. It was massive and it made me think this would take me a few days, if not a week. I stopped in front of the door and gathered myself. Just because I didn't show it didn't mean I wasn't frightened. Anything could be waiting for me. I opened a door next to a large locked shutter meant to open for forklifts. Inside was dark and a smell of perfume hit me. It made my eyes water and I took a few seconds to adjust. A hole in the ceiling was the only source of light. Swallowing hard, I started through a path towards the person waiting in the light. The floor had been covered by countless dead animals gruesomely stitched together. I saw human bodies mixed in with the piles of death near the edge of the light. It made my skin crawl, but I kept going. "Nice to meet you. I was the one who called this in," the man said when I stopped near him. He stood in a circle empty of the bodies. He hadn't cleaned up a spot beforehand. Rather, the person who laid all the bodies out left pathways and small clean openings. He held out his hand, but mine were frozen by my side. I had a bag with my cleaning supplies over my shoulder. I held onto the strap tightly as my eyes went over what I could see of the room. "Where do we even start?" I said mostly to myself. "There is a larger door through that pathway there and on the other side of the building. We should start over there," he said as he gestured towards a clear path leading into the darkness. The pale skin of his wrist and forearm made an alarm bell go off in my head. I nodded at his suggestion, but didn't move as I carefully studied his appearance. Unlike the other agents I have met, his suit jacket didn't fit. It was small. His movements were stiff because of it. He wasn't wearing suit pants, just normal black jeans. Hell, he didn't even have a button-down shirt on under his jacket. My expression didn't give away my suspicions, but the movement of my hand to my pocket did. His bright smile faded from his face and his hands shot out. For a tall, skinny bastard, he was strong as hell. I thrashed trying to get free, but he easily wrapped an arm around my torso and pinned mine to my side. He struggled with me to steal away my phone and tossed it into the mess of bodies. I was then lifted off the ground as he carried me down the pathway. I kicked and tried biting to get free. I was simply overpowered. No one was expecting me to finish this job for days. Would Samus check up on me? Would anyone even know if I'd died here until hours passed? I needed to think of a plan. He silently carried me over to something so horrifying it made me stop fighting for a moment. The bodies all lead to a dark and twisted shrine located in the middle of the building. We were far away from the sunlight. Hundreds of candles bathed the area in an orange glow that discolored the blood-stained floor. A tower of tied-together bones reached far off into the darkness. The agent that this man had stolen the jacket from had been bound to the tower with thick thorn wire. His throat cut, letting black blood freely flow from the wound. Silver bowls sat on the ground collecting the blood. At the bottom of the tower was an odd flickering jagged light. It was dark with a strange crackling noise coming from it as it moved erratically. I was tossed to the floor hard enough to sprain my wrist when I broke my fall. The bound man moved slightly but didn't raise his head. He was still alive, which was good, but we both didn't have a lot of time. The man who dragged me away ambushed the agent, stole his phone, and called for more victims. I was expecting an entire crew, and they sent a single little girl. "How understaffed in this place?" he said in a false sing-sung voice. "What is the point of all this?" I asked, voice calm, but I didn't dare stand up just yet. He didn't appear pleased I wasn't begging for my life. "The point? Can't you tell this is art? Are you asking an artist to explain his work?" he said and spread his arms out to his side. A burst of light came as thousands of hidden candles came to life on their own. My breath caught as I saw the sheer horror surrounding it. The bodies didn't just cover the floors, but they were stuck to the walls and ceiling as well. The sight was enough to make me dizzy. I shook my head trying to clear it. Although most of the bodies were animals, there had to be over a few hundred human bodies mixed into the mass of death. How did he kill so many of them without being noticed? I looked harder and realized that most of these bodies weren't fresh. If this man wasn't human, then that meant he would have had years and years to work on this feat. The warehouse looked to be at least 100 years old, with some newer updates here and there. Had he been working on this for that long? "Well, isn't it all beautiful?" the monster smugly said. "I think you're trying too hard to be edgy," I replied in a deadpan voice. That was not the response he wanted. I heard him sputter like a dying fish, his face turning red. You? This was all in service of the greatest dark god any world has ever known. I was going to use your blood in service of him, but you do not deserve that honor. He was clearly losing his cool. I glanced around trying to think of something. I needed to get the hell out of here, but I couldn't leave behind this still bleeding agent. That man left me no choice but to fight instead of flee. He lunged forward, aiming for my throat. I gripped the weapon in my pocket and waited until he was close enough to strike. I stabbed the pen as hard as I could into his stomach, causing him to cry out in pain. I then pushed the button to extend the pen into a blade to bury it deeper into his flesh. He stumbled backward, and I wasted no time running around him towards the bound agent. I tore off my jacket and used it to protect my hands to pull away the wire holding him to the tower. It wasn't properly made, so it came crumbling down in seconds. It was a miracle I dragged the injured man away and didn't get buried under a mountain of bones. My attacker hissed, sounding like a wild animal. He ripped the dagger from his stomach, tossing it aside. "You witch!" he screamed, and it was a pretty mild insult, all things considered. He could fill an entire building with the dead, and yet he couldn't swear. He might have had some stronger words for me, but something distracted us both. The bloody blade he tossed aside landed directly inside the twisting, crackling line of dark light. Sparks flew from it, and the light expanded, showing an alien landscape beyond. That man had created a rift between worlds, but it had opened somewhere he didn't want. He screamed and raced towards the rift, but wasn't able to get close due to the sheer raw power coming from it. "No, no, no! Not yet! It's not in the right spot!" he shouted, fighting against the harsh current in the air. I should have been more worried. I focused on dragging away the agent until I was forced not to. The air suddenly grew still. Everything around us froze in place. Every cell in my body screamed in fear as an unseen force took over. The orange light of the candles appeared dimmer. A pitch-black clawed hand came from the rip and took hold of the side. I don't think words could ever explain the feeling this darkness brought into the world. It was as if all joy had faded from existence, leaving only a hollow, empty feeling. Slowly the thing emerged. It was a dark god, but not the one the crazy man had wanted. A head made of dark tendrils came through. An ancient cracked skull of a long-extinct animal rested where a face should be. The body appeared to be mostly human, with skin darker than the night. The legs were that of a beast, and a long tail was the last thing to come into view. The creature first seemed to be 7 feet tall, then a pair of dark wings spread out behind it. I knew it wasn't possible, but this creature appeared larger than the space it occupied. The wings might as well stretch past the sky. I had thought the infected corpse was terrifying. This creature was simply fear itself. The man fell to his knees, face pale and teeth chattering. His mind is on the verge of breaking. "My Lord Fee," he said, and stiffly bowed his head with tears in his eyes. "Fee? Was that this thing's name?" The monster directed an eyeless glance downwards to the man, causing him to tremble so hard he wasn't able to do anything else. "I made all this for you," he shouted, trying to get on the god's good side. The massive form took a step closer, and the body sharked back down to its 7-foot-tall size. He paced on clawed feet, the skull moving to look over the room. It was impossible to tell if it was pleased or not. "I even prepared 2 playthings for you." My head shot in that bastard's direction, offended. The jerk was handing us over to save his skin. Suddenly a clawed hand was in front of my face. I didn't even see that god move, and yet he was right there ready to take me. If I let it touch me, then I would be subjected to torture no human could even dream of. "Fuck off." My words were stern and void of the fear I felt. I was too scared to even shake, so I just stared down the god in front of me. For once, my lack of an expressive face paid off. The hand paused, but then started to get closer. My hand snapped up, slapping it away as if I was dealing with a pesky sibling. The silence was deafening. We all sat at a standstill waiting for each other to react. Finally, it was broken by a long, loud laughter coming from the skull. The dark god bent over from laughing so hard. The killer's mouth fell open, mind broken by the reaction. He reached out to try and touch me again. I kept slapping the hand away until he got the message. "Okay, I like you," the god admitted, speaking for the first time. I didn't know if that was a good thing or not. "What? Her? She disrespected you, and I did all this," the man shouted, rising to his feet. He crossed his arms and the skull moved around to take in the room again. "Don't you think you're trying too hard to be edgy?" Fee commented. I didn't think I would agree with a nightmare creature over anything, let alone something like this. The man's face turned red from rage and he charged forwards. His body shifted into something more animalistic, ready to kill. Fee waved a hand and the threat was dragged away into the floor by countless dark tentacles. They were nice enough to leave behind the stolen suit jacket. "Anyway," Fee said, directing his skull toward me. I tightened my protective hold over the fallen agent. Sure, I wasn't dead, but that didn't mean I was out of the woods just yet. This agent needed medical treatment soon, or else he wasn't going to make it. "Hand that one over. I need to mess him up," Fee demanded, making a grabby hand motion. "You can shove that idea directly in your ass," I stated. He shrugged, cracking his neck. The pressure came back into the air as if slowly came down on my shoulders, threatening to suffocate me. Fee got down to my level, the tip of the skull inches away from my nose. The one who foolishly made an open gate for me to hijack is a simple person. I can break him in a few months, if not weeks. An agent is a different story. He'll take longer. I need a toy. If I get bored, then I start taking it out on everyone else. Now, what would you rather do? This world be slowly thrown into nightmares beyond imagination, or for you to forfeit a single life? His words echoed through my brain. The pressure became so intense I almost folded. It hurt. Just being near him made my skin feel as if it was melting off. I gritted my teeth and kept my head raised to stare into the dark, empty sockets. "Just watch Netflix like everyone else if you're that bored," I said, struggling to get my words out. The pressure in the air snapped back to normal. Fee's demeanor changed and his body relaxed. "Oh shit, this world has Netflix?" he asked and stood back up. "There are other worlds?" I pressed, still trying to recover. "Well, duh. Why do you think the corporation is so busy?" My head swam from the answer. In such a short amount of time, I found out there were supernatural creatures and an organization that keeps them in line. Dark gods and now different worlds out there. Are they all like this one? I said, wondering if there was a world out there with another version of myself. Was Victor changing into something else always meant to happen? Or was he happy somewhere else? Hell, if I know. I'm sure there is a lot that are, but I don't pay attention to what you humans do for the most part. All I care about is booze, porn, and true crime dramas. Man, I'm like a basic white bitch when it comes to true crime dramas. I let myself raise an eyebrow at him. I don't think I like this so-called dark god too much. That's good to know. I need to leave and get this guy to the doctor. I started to drag the fallen agent backward again, but only got a few steps when the pressure came down. It froze my muscles no matter how hard I fought against it. I don't think Netflix will be enough to keep me from having fun with this world. I need something else to keep my boredom at bay. What are you offering? Fee said in a low, raspy voice that suited his title. I have an old 3DS and a lot of games. I tried. Cute. But not enough. Why don't you do the world a favor and offer yourself? He suggested. I was too scared to raise my head and I hated myself for it. Sweat started on my back as a chill went through my body. In what way? I asked, voice somehow staying calm. It's simple. Keep doing this job. Involve yourself in the most interesting events as you're able, and then hand over your memories to me. I finally looked up. Confusion took over my fear. Why would care about something like that? I said, not understanding the request. I'll let you try and figure that out. That's my deal. I'll come to you whenever I feel like it. It could be 6 months or a year. In exchange for yourself, I'll spare this world. And I mean that. You'll lose everything you are when I take away your memories. I chewed on my cheek, debating on what to do. I didn't have any power here. If I refused, he could easily crush every living thing on the planet and then move on. Will you let me think about it? Fee laughed again at my words. I doubted he had too many humans talk to him in the way I had been. It might be what saved my life. Fine. I'll show up again in the future and ask you again. Yourself or this world. Oh, and I would suggest you not tell anyone about this encounter. I'm a big deal and the corporation may give you a hard time if they knew you lived being in the same room with me. Later, Gator. I blinked, then the god was gone. Simple as that. My body fell into terrible shakes that lasted for a few minutes. I needed to collect myself before I dug around in the left-behind suit jacket to find the agent's phone. Another couple of minutes passed and then more agents came charging into the building. Samus and Toph were with them. Both of the men swept me up in an embarrassing hug. Samus, near tears, apologized. I was sent into such a bad situation, and Toph appeared angry with himself for not being there to help. I wonder if this is what having older brothers was like. I needed to fill out a lot of paperwork. I didn't tell anyone about the deal I made with Fee, or that he even showed up. I lied, saying the killer had been dragged into the weird portal by a monster I didn't get a clear look at, and left it at that. Lupa asked that I repeat my story to him. His eyes narrowed as if he knew I was lying, but he didn't voice his concerns. A few days passed before I was able to see the injured agent from the building. I met him inside a clinic run by the corporation. His face was pale and his neck bandaged, but he looked much better than I expected. I heard he liked books, so I picked up a few used paperback ones instead of some flowers. I'm sorry that you were put into such a dangerous situation. I should have been stronger, he admitted in a soft voice when I entered the room. I'm glad we both got out of there alive. I told him, but he didn't appear like he had forgiven himself. If you beat up that guy, then we might not have met and become friends. That cheered him up. The door opened, directing our attention towards a man walking inside. He looked around my age, with dark hair and Asian features. If he put more weight on his thin frame, he would be fairly handsome. Saren, the doctor said you're able to come home tonight. Do you want me to stay with you until checkout? The man asked after he gave a polite nod in my direction. Are you two dating? I wasn't sure why I asked that. Normally I didn't care about that sort of thing. No. Yes. They both spoke at once. Saren was the one who agreed and then became mortified by his answer. The other man looked over at the poor embarrassed agent and then back towards me. Maybe. He corrected and then sat on the edge of the bed. Can we talk? He asked. I pieced out a few seconds afterward, leaving them alone, Saren looking as if he regretted that I saved his life. After all that, I didn't want to keep doing this job. But I needed to pay my bills and, You know, the whole fate of the world now rested on my shoulders. I don't think I could stay motivated through all this if I didn't have the support of the people around me, even if some of them could be a bit overbearing. At the moment, I'm still ready to face death every day for these people. I became a park ranger in Montana, now I'm being hunted. PT-1. It was my first day in the field as a park ranger. My first duty station was in one of the most remote regions in the state. The sky over Montana hung heavy with storm clouds casting darkness over the endless trees. The mountains lined the horizon, their peaks disappearing into the sky. I had never seen mountains so big, jagged, and imposing. I was eager to make a good impression, eager to prove I belonged here. This job had always been my dream. But, as I drove up the narrow dirt road to the ranger station, a knot of unease began to creep into my stomach. The isolation of this place was palpable, even from my car. The silence of the wilderness pressed in on me, broken only by the wind against the tree branches or the distant cry of an animal. Civilization was far away, and for the first time since taking this job, I realized how truly alone I was going to be. But, despite this, I felt confident and excited to put my new training to use. The ranger station came into view, smoke from the chimney rising into the air. It was nestled at the edge of Pine Creek Forest. The station was small, squat, and unassuming, honestly more of a cabin than a headquarters. Standing by the entrance was Earl Bennett, a burly man in his mid-50s with graying hair poking out from under his hat, and a weather-beaten face that had clearly seen its share of harsh winters. He didn't smile when he saw me approaching, and he skipped the pleasantries. "You're late," he grunted, glancing at his watch. I swallowed hard, feeling my confidence suddenly turn into nervousness. "Sorry, sir. The roads are always like that. It's middle of nowhere Montana," Kitty cut me off. "You'll learn soon enough. Out here, you better be prepared for anything." I nodded, feeling small under his stern gaze, like a child getting a good lecture from his parents. "Well, come on then," he said as he motioned for me to follow him into the station. As I entered, I spotted another ranger sitting quietly in the corner, staring out the window at the coming storm. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with long black hair tied back in a ponytail and a calm expression on his face. Earl didn't introduce him immediately. The station was simple: a few desks, a gun safe, a kitchen, a radio room, and sleeping quarters in the back. Earl handed me a map of the region. "Your job is to patrol this area. You're going to check for signs of poaching, illegal campsites, and anything else that doesn't belong. Poaching's been a problem around here for a while. Keep your eyes open, learn your area, and don't ever let yourself get too comfortable." I nodded, unfolding the map and scanning the area. My territory stretched deep into the dense forests, far beyond where most people would dare to venture. "And him?" I asked, motioning toward the man by the window. Earl glanced over. "That's Daniel Black Elk. He's the quiet type, but he knows these woods better than anyone. If he gives you guidance, you better listen up. His family's been on this land for generations." I extended my hand to Daniel. "Tom Carter, good to meet you, Daniel." Daniel's grip was firm but gentle, his eyes never leaving mine as we shook hands. "Daniel Black Elk," he said in a voice that was low and smooth. "Welcome to Pine Creek." Earl wasted no time getting down to business. He spread a map of the area across the table and tapped at it with his thick fingers. "This is your territory now. The Pine Creek region is thousands of acres of forests, mountains, rivers, and lakes. You'll be responsible for these areas, keeping an eye out for anything unusual." I nodded, trying to absorb the sheer scale of the territory. "Anything I should be particularly looking for?" Everything, Earl said flatly. This ain't some well-maintained national park. It's rough terrain. Weather changes fast, animals aren't always friendly, and the nearest help is hours away. If you get in trouble out there, you're on your own. So don't get into trouble. His tone left no room for argument, and I nodded again. He wasn't exaggerating. The sheer remoteness of the place was beginning to sink in. What about the poaching? I asked. Who's behind it? Earl leaned back in his chair, a grim look on his face. Locals, mostly. Some of them hunt for sport, some for money. Wolves, elk, bears, you name it. They know the forest better than most, and they don't take kindly to us rangers poking around their business. I frowned. Sounds like it could get dangerous. It can, Earl said, then looked out the window, the muscles in his jaw tightening. But there's worse out there than poachers. His words hung in the air like a fog, and for a moment, a heavy silence settled over the room. Daniel glanced at Earl but said nothing. There was an unspoken tension between the two of them, something I wasn't privy to yet. Like what? I asked, breaking the silence. Earl's eyes flicked back to me, hard and cold. Just keep your wits about you, and don't go out there trying to be a hero and get yourself or anyone else hurt. The first week of patrols was uneventful, but the forest had a way of unsettling me even when nothing happened. The trees loomed tall and silent, their trunks dark and twisted, like ancient giants frozen in time. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig set my nerves on edge, and I constantly found myself looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. I reminded myself that I would get used to it, with time. Daniel accompanied me on a few of my first patrols, guiding me through the more difficult terrain. He rarely spoke unless it was necessary, but when he did, it was always to point out something I would have otherwise missed, like animals' tracks or a hole to avoid stepping in. His knowledge of the land was impressive, and though he was quiet, I appreciated his presence. There was something calming about him, like he was in tune with the land in a way I couldn't yet comprehend. I felt safe with him. One afternoon, while we were hiking through a particularly dense section of the forest, I asked more about him and what his story was. My family's been here for centuries, Daniel said, his voice low. Long before the park was established, before the settlers came. My people have always been the stewards of this land. We know its secrets. Secrets? I asked, curious. Daniel paused, looking out at the trees with a distant expression. The land remembers. It has its own memory, and its own spirits. There are more things out here than just man and animals. I felt a chill run down my spine at his words, but I wasn't sure if he was being serious or if it was just part of his culture. Maybe he was just speaking metaphorically. Still, there was something about the way he spoke, so matter-of-fact, that made me believe him. That evening, after we returned to the station, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow felt like it was something following me, and every gust of wind carried whispers to my ears. I had been on edge already, and the conversation with Daniel didn't help. Earl brushed off my concerns when I mentioned to him what Daniel had said about there being more in the forest than just man or animal. That's just first week jitters, he said. The forest can get under your skin if you let it. Just stick to your patrols and don't go looking for trouble. We all felt like that when we were new. And don't go listening to none of Daniel's superstitions. The guy knows his stuff, but he can get a little out there, if you know what I mean. I wanted to believe him, but the unease gnawed at me, a constant presence at the back of my mind. A few days later, I was out on patrol by myself, covering the western section of the forest. The day was overcast, and the clouds hung low and heavy, casting everything in a dull, gray light. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine needles, and the forest was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of wildlife absent. I vaguely recalled something in my training about when the forest goes silent. As I made my way through a clearing, I spotted something unusual near the edge of the tree line. At first, I thought it was just a pile of leaves or debris, but as I got closer, I realized it was the mangled remains of an animal. My heart sank as I knelt down to examine the scene. The animal, what looked like had been a deer, had been completely ripped apart, its flesh torn and shredded in a way that didn't seem natural. The bite marks were too large and jagged to be from any predator I knew of in the area. I'd seen wolf kills before, and this wasn't the same. It was savage, brutal, almost as if whatever had killed it had done so for sport rather than for food. The ground around the carcass was disturbed, the grass flattened and trampled as if there had been some kind of struggle. But what stood out to me the most were the tracks. They were large, far larger than any wolf or bear, and they were shaped different. The toes were elongated, almost claw-like, and they dug deep into the soil, leaving deep impressions. My stomach churned as I took a few steps back, my hand instinctively going to the radio on my belt. "Earl," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I found something. Looks like a poaching site, maybe, but something's not right." "What do you mean, not right?" Earl's voice crackled over the radio. "The animal, it's been torn apart. And the tracks. I've never seen anything like them. They're freaking huge." There was a long pause on the other end, and when Earl finally spoke again, his voice was tense. "Where are you?" "I'm about a mile west of the old logging road, near the clearing." "Head back to the station." "No." The urgency in his voice sent a jolt of adrenaline through me, and I didn't waste any time. As I turned to head back, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. Something was moving between the trees, darting from trunk to trunk with a speed that made my heart skip a beat. I froze, my eyes scanning the dense forest, but whatever it was had already disappeared into the shadows. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my pulse pounding in my ears, but there was no further movement. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered, a heavy weight pressing down on me as I made my way back to the station as fast as I could. When I returned to the station, Earl was waiting for me at the door, his expression unreadable. "Show me the site," he said, grabbing his rifle from the rack by the door. I nodded and led him back into the forest, my nerves still on edge from the encounter. As we approached the clearing, I pointed out the carcass and the tracks, watching as Earl knelt down to examine them. He didn't say anything for a long time, his brow furrowed in thought. Finally, he stood up, a grim look on his face. "Could be a bear," he said, but I could tell even he didn't believe it. "Bears don't leave tracks like that," I said quietly. Earl shot me a sharp look, but before he could respond, Daniel pulled up to the site in his truck, his face as calm and unreadable as ever. Daniel examined the site for a moment, before Earl again said, "Grizzly, I think, by the looks of it." "That's no grizzly," Daniel said softly, his eyes locked on the tracks. "That's something else." Earl's jaw tightened, and for a moment, the two of them exchanged a look. There was something they weren't telling me, something they both knew but were hesitant to say out loud. "Well, what is it then?" I asked, impatiently, feeling a knot of dread forming in my stomach. Daniel glanced at me. "We should head back. It's getting dark." I wanted to press him for more information, but the tone in his voice left no room for argument. We made our way back to the station in silence, the weight of the unknown pressing down on me like a suffocating blanket. That night, after Earl had gone to bed, I found myself sitting in the kitchen with Daniel. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the fire crackled softly in the fireplace. "What's really out there?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Daniel didn't answer right away. He stared into the fire, his dark eyes reflecting the flickering flames. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and steady. "You ever heard of the Wendigo?" I frowned. "Wendigo, that's like an old Native American thing, right?" I asked. "It's an old legend, yes," Daniel said, his eyes never leaving the fire. "A spirit of the forest. Some say was once a man, a hunter who became lost in the wilderness and resorted to cannibalism to survive. But in doing so, he became something else, something cursed. The Wendigo is a creature of hunger, always starving, always hunting. It craves flesh, and once it tastes it, it becomes insatiable. I felt a chill crawl up my spine at his words, but I tried to keep my voice steady. So you're saying, that's what is out there? Daniel finally looked at me, his expression serious. I don't know. But there are stories. The Wendigo can mimic voices, lure people into the woods. It's fast, faster than anything natural. And once it sets its sights on you, it won't stop until it's fed. I swallowed hard, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. And if it finds you? Daniel's gaze was unwavering. You run. You don't stop. You don't look back. And you pray it loses interest. His words hung in the air like a dark omen, and as I lay in bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the shadows of the forest. The next morning, Earl ordered a full patrol of the area. He was visibly tense, though he tried to maintain his usual gruff demeanor. We split up. Earl took the north, I took the west, and Daniel headed east. As I made my way through the forest, the weight of Daniel's story pressed on me like a heavy stone, and I honestly began to rethink my career choice. The forest felt different today. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves were absent, replaced by an eerie stillness that kept me on edge. Every step I took seemed too loud, the crunch of twigs under my feet echoing through the trees. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the faint scent of something rotten, something that made my stomach turn. I found myself constantly scanning the trees, searching for any sign of movement. My nerves were shot, every shadow a potential threat, every gust of wind a whisper of something sinister. As I ventured deeper into the forest, the trees grew closer together, their branches intertwining overhead like a canopy of twisted arms. Then, I heard it. A low, guttural growl, so deep. It was faint, so faint that I almost thought I imagined it. My heart leapt into my throat, and I stopped in my tracks, my hand going to the gun on my hip. I listened, straining to hear it again. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, from somewhere behind me, came the sound of something moving through the undergrowth. It sounded fast, impossibly fast. I spun around, my pulse racing, but there was nothing there. Just the trees, silent. I took a step back, my hand tightening on my gun. The growl came again, this time louder, closer. I turned, my heart hammering in my chest, and saw something moving between the trees. It was a shadow, long and gaunt, darting from trunk to trunk with a speed that made my stomach churn. I couldn't see it clearly, just flashes of pale skin, long limbs, and glowing eyes that burned with an unnatural light. The creature lunged with an inhuman grace, its body almost serpentine as it weaved between the trees. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished into the shadows. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might have a heart attack. I stood frozen, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps, my gun drawn but useless in my trembling hands. For a moment, I considered calling out to Earl or Daniel, but something told me that making noise would only draw it closer. Then, from deep in the forest, I heard my name. Tom. The voice was faint, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. It was Earl's voice, calling to me from somewhere beyond the trees. For a moment I felt relieved. I had been found. My instincts screamed at me to run toward it, to get out of there. The voice, it sounded so real, so close. Tom, over here. I took a step forward, my mind racing, then I paused. Earl shouldn't be this far into my section of the forest. He was supposed to be on the North Patrol, miles from here. But the voice, it sounded just like Earl. Tom. This time, it was louder, more insistent. I took another step, my legs trembling beneath me. Something about the voice was wrong, though. It sounded like Earl, but there was an edge to it, a sharpness that sent a shiver down my spine. Suddenly, Daniel's voice echoed in my mind. It can mimic voices. Lure people into the woods. I stopped in my tracks, my heart racing. It wasn't Earl. It couldn't be. Tom. The voice was closer now, but I didn't move. I couldn't move. My breath came in short, panicked gasps, and the forest around me seemed to close in, the trees towering over me. Then, from behind me, came a rustling sound, soft at first, but growing louder, closer. I didn't dare turn around. Every instinct in my body told me not to look, not to acknowledge whatever was behind me. But the rustling grew louder, and I could feel something watching me, approaching me, something predatory. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Everything became silent. Tom had whispered, this time directly in my ear. I ran. I didn't think, didn't look back. I just ran, my feet pounding the forest floor, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The trees blurred past me as I sprinted through the forest, branches whipping at my face, the wind roaring in my ears. I could hear it behind me, its footsteps impossibly fast, closing the distance with terrifying speed. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Somehow, I made it to the edge of the forest and stumbled into the clearing. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. When I finally looked back, the thing was gone. But the feeling of being watched still remained. I felt as if we're prey, and it had just been playing with its food. When I returned to the station, Earl and Daniel were waiting for me. Earl's face was pale, his usual gruff demeanor replaced by a quiet tension that unnerved me. He looked worried. What happened? Earl asked, his voice tight. I told them everything, the growl, the creature, the voice. As I spoke, Daniel's expression grew darker, his eyes narrowing in thought. Earl, however, remained silent, his jaw clenched. When I finished, the room was filled with an oppressive silence. Finally, Daniel spoke. You encountered it, the Wendigo, he said, his voice low. Earl shot him a sharp look. Don't start with that bullshit. It's not bullshit, Daniel said, his tone firm. You saw the tracks. You heard the voice yourself once too, Earl. You know what's out there. You've always known. I looked between them, confusion and fear swirling in my mind. What's going on? What do you mean? Earl let out a long, weary sigh, rubbing a hand over his face. Yeah, I heard a voice once too, calling me, he said, his voice heavy with reluctance. But it's just some old legend. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. And it's hunting me? Daniel nodded. It's been here long before the park was established, long before any of us. It's a part of the land, tied to it. And once it sets its sights on you. He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't have to. The weight of his words was clear. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. So what do I do? Earl and Daniel exchanged a long, tense look before Daniel finally spoke. We'll stay in groups for a few days, until we figure it out. The days that followed were a blur of fear and paranoia. Every patrol felt like a death sentence, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig sending my heart into overdrive. I purchased a laptop on the dark web. I never should have bought that laptop. It turned my life completely upside down. It all started on a late-night browsing spree, the kind that often led me down the rabbit holes of obscure dark websites, offering all kinds of tantalizing offers. You could find anything imaginable there, from legal to the illegal, and everything in between. That's when I found it, a listing that seemed innocent enough, buried among a jumble of more questionable items. Old laptop, perfect for refurbishing. Minimal wear and tear, in good working condition, the ad read. I'm a tech enthusiast who is always looking for new projects, and this one was too good to pass up. The only reservation I had was the seller's lack of reviews, and those that existed were vague, making it hard to tell if the product was legit. But the price was unbeatable, and I figured it was worth the risk. As I clicked buy now, a sense of unease settled in my stomach, but I brushed it off. I needed a distraction, and the laptop seemed like the perfect project. When the laptop finally arrived, it looked a little worn but had a certain retro charm to it. I wiped it down, plugged it in, and powered it up. The screen flickered to life, revealing a handful of files. Most were harmless, old documents, music files, and applications, but one stood out. "Do not open," it read in bold, red lettering. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the mouse. Curiosity gnawed at me. It had to be a joke left by the previous owner. I was a seasoned hacker, I could of course handle a simple file. Taking a deep breath, I clicked. Immediately, the screen filled with static. The sound was sharp, cutting through the silence and sending a chill down my spine. I wanted to close the laptop, but I continued to watch mesmerized. The video appeared, grainy and dark. A strange-looking figure stood before a flickering candle, chanting in a language I couldn't understand. His voice was low and haunting. Suddenly, he turned to the camera, revealing his hollow eyes that seemed to stare straight through me. The video then abruptly cuts off, leaving only an eerie silence. I closed the laptop, a little taken aback but not totally shaken. "It's just a video," I whispered to myself. Nothing more. But I had no idea that the real disturbances were only about to begin in my life. The next morning, I woke up to a flood of notifications. My social media accounts were filled with strange messages, and people I hadn't spoken to in years were frantically emailing, calling, and texting me. I was overwhelmed, trying to make sense of it all. Then, an old school friend called, his voice sounding shaky. He asked if I was okay, saying he'd received an email with a video of me, trying to hang myself. I froze in shock. "I'm sending it now," he said. The email arrived, and my heart raced as I clicked the video. It was a grainy recording of me in my living room, standing beneath a noose. I watched in horror as I positioned myself to go through with it. I had no memory of this. I had never done anything like this. How could this even happen? I asked myself. Just then, the doorbell rang, followed by loud banging. My stomach churned. Was it the police? Had someone reported the video? How am I going to explain any of this to them? Hesitant, I opened the door, bracing myself for a tough conversation with the police. But instead of the authorities, it was my girlfriend, Stella. Her mascara was smeared all over her face from crying, but her expression was nothing but pure fury. Without a word, she stormed in, shoving me back onto the couch. Before I could react, she kicked off her shoe and started hitting me with it, hard, relentless blows as I tried to shield myself. Stella, wait. I can explain. I pleaded. That video was fake. I wasn't trying to do anything. She paused, her chest heaving with anger, then pulled out her phone. Explain this, then, she spat, thrusting the screen in front of me. It was another video, this time, of me sitting on a beach with a woman who wasn't Stella. The two of us were laughing and flirting while she sat on my lap. Tears streamed down Stella's face. Are you saying this is fake too? She asked, her voice cracking. I stared at the screen, dumbfounded. I didn't recognize the woman in the video. Nor have I ever been to that beach as well. None of it made sense. But before I could even form a response, Stella threw her shoe at me one last time and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. I was left sitting there, reeling from the sheer impossibility of it all. Then my phone rang again, this time it was my parents. They said they'd received a news clip showing me in jail after a drunk driving accident. A news clip? Of me in jail? How could that even be possible? I asked myself again, as I stood in my own living room completely bewildered. My head spun as I spent the next few hours trying to calm down friends and family, assuring them I was fine and that it was all some sick prank. But was it really a prank? I reluctantly glanced at the laptop as a wave of dread washed over me. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly approached it and opened it again. The screen flickered to life. This time, all the files were gone, except for two, the original Do Not Open file and a new one labeled Victims. My hands trembled as I clicked on Victims. A list appeared that was long and chilling. I scrolled down, each entry accompanied by photos and usernames from the dark web, people who were probably no longer alive. My blood ran cold when I saw my name. I was number 178, the most recent victim. My status was being shown as in progress. As I clicked on my folder, a photo of me appeared, along with details only someone who had been watching me would know. Some of the other usernames on the list were familiar, too, people I'd seen online on the dark web and forums I frequent. I often wondered where they suddenly vanished. Now I knew why. And I realized I might be next. Panic surged through me. I slammed the laptop shut, grabbed it, and raced out the door. I drove for hours until I found a secluded spot near a dumpster. I tossed the laptop out and drove over it several times to make sure it was destroyed. For the first time in days, I felt some relief. But it didn't last long. When I returned home, my blood froze. The laptop was sitting on my desk, as if it had never left. A chill crept down my spine as I stood there, staring in horror. Paranoia consumed me. Right then I knew I had a huge problem on my hands and had to find a solution for it no matter what. So I started looking at online forums dedicated to paranormal activities and digital hauntings. Maybe, just maybe someone else had encountered a similar experience. My fingers flew across the keyboard, typing furiously, desperate for answers. As I scrolled through hundreds of posts, I found one that caught my eye. It was headlined, "The Cursed Laptop." The poster detailed a story eerily similar to mine. After purchasing an old laptop from the dark web, he began receiving ominous messages and videos that terrorized the user. His advice was simple but chilling. Confront it. Do a cleansing ritual. So, I researched further on the dark web, uncovering an array of rituals involving salt, candles, and incantation. I gathered the supplies, feeling both foolish and desperate at the same time. As night fell, I prepared the ritual in my dimly lit apartment, following all the instructions to the letter. I lit a row of candles on either side of the room and drew a circle on the middle of the floor using salt. Once I stood inside the circle, I started with the incantation. "Spirits of the digital realm, I call upon you to reveal yourself," I said, my voice slightly trembling. "I seek to end this torment." Nothing happened at first, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. But then the laptop flickered violently. The screen flashed, and the ominous file reappeared, more vivid than before. The strange figure was looking at me intently through the laptop as if he was trying to get a measure of me. Suddenly, the lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness. Even the light from the candles was being blocked from illuminating the room by some unseen powerful force. And then slowly the candles started to spread a little bit light around the room, casting a creepy-looking silhouette by my side. Right then, I felt a cold and putrid breath against my neck, and a voice whispered in my ear, "You invited me in, Anthony." I could feel his presence just behind the salt circle, and I realized he couldn't get closer. This was the same figure that appeared on the video first when I opened the laptop. But in real, he looked a lot more terrifying. He carefully stood at the edge of my vision, his dark silhouette blurring the boundaries of reality. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The figure stepped closer, its face a distorted visage of rage. "You opened the door, and now you must pay the price." Terror clawed at my insides, but I forced myself to stand my ground. "I didn't mean to. I just wanted to refurbish the laptop." "It's too late for remorse," he hissed, a chilling echo of my own fear. In that moment, I remembered the ritual. I needed to confront this entity, to assert my will. "I reject you. I will not be your victim. Spirits of the digital realm, I command you to leave." I shouted at the top of my lungs. The temperature dropped sharply, and the shadows lengthened. I felt a pull, a tug-of-war between my will and the spirit's malevolent force as everything started to swirl around me. The figure roared in anger, while the screen flickered wildly as it struggled against my command. Suddenly my room was plunged into complete darkness, and the power finally returned a few seconds later. When my gaze shifted towards the table, I realized the laptop was gone. It had disappeared. Finally, out of my life for good. Oh, thank God and the Holy Spirits. After that day, I changed all my electronic devices. Yes, I replaced every one of them. I even deleted my email and other online accounts and opened completely new ones. I didn't want to leave anything to chance. In fact, it has been over 3 months since I visited the dark web. And I don't plan to visit anytime soon. Then I also managed to get back with my girlfriend Stella. Somehow I was able to convince her of my innocence. So one day, while we were on vacation and having a good time, a message suddenly appeared on my phone. Attached was a single folder. My hands trembled as I stared at the screen, heart pounding. The folder's name flashed at me in bold red lettering, "Do not open." Cal's Cosmic Video and more, the tapes. I miss movie rental stores. Of all the things that technology has taken from us, that's one of the greatest losses. I'm biased, sure, since it was my first major job and helped me get through college, but come on, there was nothing like it, right? Cal's was a town institution, and I had been going there for years already by the time I started working there in 1997. I'm honestly amazed they hired me instead of banning me from the store outright, as much trouble as we caused back then. It was always a challenge to see who could sneak into the adult video room and shoplift without getting caught. Little did I know how much I would hate the stupid kids like me who did that. It was definitely a product of its time, with a renovation every decade or so that really brought it into the, present. At the time, at least. Think it was 95 when the last update was done on the original store, and that was a neon nightmare that was trying way too hard to be cool. Not that it needed to be cool, considering it was the only rental place within 30 miles for our little nowhere town. Every weekend, without fail, this place would be full of families looking for the latest tape to entertain the kids, teenagers trying to pass off a fake ID for scary movies, and the occasional weirdo who was spending far too much time by the adult room. Yeah, those were a pain in the ass. I got hired on in '97, summer before my senior year of high school. It wasn't bad, all things considered, and beat the shit out of working the IGA market down the road. Pushing carts in the South Georgia summer wasn't something I want to wish on my worst enemy, so getting to work in constant air conditioning was a godsend. Seriously, if I never push a fucking shopping cart through the heat of Satan's musty taint, it'll be too damn soon. Sorry, back to Cal's. I'm getting old and tend to ramble, so, yeah, sorry. I started in '97, mostly just working during the day in the summer. It was good money for a kid at the time, and hey, it put gas in my car and gave me a way to meet people, so it wasn't all bad. Things changed a good bit when we moved into the mall a few years later, but, sorry, getting ahead of myself again. Anyway, normal enough job for the most part, especially back in the days when home video was a booming business and video stores still had a place in this world. I would work days for the most part during my first couple of months there, but when school started back, I started getting put on the closing shifts. When I tell you this place was a whole different animal when the sun went down. I saw some weird shit. Nothing started off too crazy. When I went to closing shift, my first night was mostly uneventful, though probably because I had Dustin, the assistant manager at the time, showing me what to do before I was left alone. Things were mostly the same as working during the day, except with the whole added task of locking the door when I leave now. Big responsibilities was how closing was sold to me, and woo boy was I whelmed. We went through the motions, taking the returns for the day, checking them into the system and inspecting to make sure everything was still intact. We had been renting video games for a few years too, so it was typically up to us to check the cartridges at the end of the day and make sure they still worked. God, the PS1 release that year was a nightmare thanks to the new world of scratchable discs. People didn't know how to take care of the damn things and they always came back messed up. First few nights of closing were fine. Dustin gave me the lowdown on what to expect working nights, regular customers, people to be on the lookout for, how to fix the tape rewinder in case it decided to eat a VHS, stuff like that. Usually we just ended up going through the drop-off bin and making calls about late returns, which were differing levels of pleasant depending on who got the call. Hell, sometimes you tell someone their copy of Ghost is 3 weeks late and they come up to the store to curse at you personally while throwing the tape at your face. Fuck you too, Miss Griffords. Now, going through the drop-off tapes was a varied experience. If you were around in the time of VHS, you know that they could be very easily recorded over. The even worse thing is that the recording could be at any point in the tape. That means we would have to throw every single tape in and watch on fast forward, making sure that nothing extra might be on the returns. Some things were innocent enough, probably just mistakes by stupid kids. The occasional kids movie would cut off right in the middle, suddenly hitting a loud action figure commercial before going into an episode of Street Sharks or Beetleborgs. Can never miss those Saturday morning cartoons. Others were ranging in quality. I recall there being one copy of Homeward Bound that became a prized item of the shop, though it would never go up for rent again. There was a very attractive woman in town who decided to record a very intimate message for the manager who was in charge when I got hired. He was fired not long after that. The tape was treated as a holy relic though. Then we started getting the unmarked tapes. I didn't even realize it when going through the basket since I would just throw the stack of tapes into the VCR to check before putting them into the books. Hell, half the tapes were so worn down they couldn't have the name read on them anyway. Assuming they weren't already plastered over with a giant Cal's Cosmic Video alien sticker so people didn't try to pawn them. The first one. I'll never forget the first tape. It was me, alone, on shift closing up on a Friday night. It was already a wild night, with one shoplifter trying to snag a copy of Final Fantasy VII and getting himself the cuffs instead. With how insane everything was in our ridiculous hours on weekends, it was well past midnight when I finally started going through the tapes. The usual suspects came through: tapes of The Lion King, Predator, Howard the fucking Duck for some god-awful reason. It was the last one, and when I first popped it in, I didn't think to look at the title. I just went by what I saw on screen, considering by now I could recognize half of the movies here by one frame. I put the tape in. At first I assumed it was a found footage movie, kind of like Man Bites Dog and Cannibal Holocaust. Blair Witch Project wouldn't be out for a while, so it wasn't a booming subgenre quite yet. We got obscure titles from time to time though, so I just figured it was one I may not have seen yet. Except then, through the grainy static and tracking signal on the tape, cows came into view. I could see the huge stupid neon signs, almost unintelligible in the shit quality it was filmed on. It was unmistakable though, and as it came closer I started to notice details. It was night time, and lights were on inside the store. As the camera got closer, I could make out a figure inside, standing at counter. It came right up to the glass then, gliding through the bushes outside to press as close in as it could without shattering the window. In the moment, I didn't even think about it, I just immediately started mashing the eject button like it was an emergency call. I threw the tape, don't ask me why, and it landed over by the new release section. Next move was calling the police, because at this rate I wasn't ready to fuck around. On that tape, the figure standing at the counter was me. I would take it as some kind of prank or something from my friends later, but at the time it freaked me the hell out. It was filmed that night, with me wearing the same Night of the Living Dead t-shirt I was right then and there. Swear to God I was hiding behind the counter clutching a box cutter until the cops finally knocked on the door. Even then it was a minute before I could work up the courage to even exit my hiding spot. They watched the tape, but wouldn't believe me when I said I hadn't noticed anyone all night. Supposedly it was just teenage pranks, trying to scare people as it got closer to Halloween. It was useless even trying to talk to them about it, even after they saw the damn tape. Assholes just left without even filing a report, leaving me alone in this neon bastion on the dark street. I was scared shitless. I left the video on the counter with a note, hoping it was as they said, just a prank. The next day I was off, and didn't plan on leaving my house unless I was dragged out. My plan went well, until around 11 at night when our phones started ringing. Mom was pissed, to say the least, thinking it was some girl calling around for me before I answered. Hell, she probably still believes that, considering I picked up and immediately got asked to come to the shop. Dustin was closing that night. This dude is always about getting his shit done on time and getting out of there, so he was already going through the numerous returns for the night. He got the same kind of video, showing him standing at the counter, wearing the exact same outfit as he was right then and there. I guess he had read the note I left, because he was asking me if it was some elaborate prank. When I kept denying it, he finally believed me. The shaking in his voice gave him away, and considering he was relatively unflappable, that made me worry. This guy got held up at gunpoint for the register one day and didn't flinch, so getting shaken like this was something. What else could I do? I got in my car and practically sped down there, arriving not long after the cops. Surprise, surprise, they didn't believe him either, instead just putting it up to the two of us pranking them now instead of each other. Assholes wouldn't believe us until the even worse films started coming in. I ended up hanging around and helping him finish out the night, because I was still freaked out from the night before, and if someone didn't think I was crazy, then I was sticking by them. This creepy feeling stuck in the air all night, unease settling in as we checked the last few tapes, wrapping up and locking the doors before midnight rolled around. A couple of weeks passed, we didn't get any more of the unmarked tapes, but both of us were pretty on edge, all things considered. It was later on a Wednesday night when things went straight to hell. We closed earlier on Wednesdays, so things weren't so bad. 9 p.m. rolls around, we lock the doors and head out. Unfortunately, it was that time of year when it would get dark early, so nighttime was well underway before I started going through the return bin. Going through, one by one, I pulled tapes from hard plastic rental boxes, pushing them into our VHS and making sure everything was still intact. Fast forward through the movie, see everything is good and unedited, then rewind and put it back in the returns pile for whoever opened the next day to put on shelves. There, at the bottom of the bin, was an unmarked tape. This thing was full already when I came in after school let out. 3 in the afternoon, sun shining bright in the fall weather. Not that fall weather was anything nice in the south, considering it was still a furnace outside. There was no way this thing was returned later than noon at the most. My morbid curiosity got the best of me though, pushing it into the VCR and hitting play. Static took over the blue screen for a moment, the camera approaching from across the road this time. Bright lights glared through the window, bursting against the pitch-black night of the film. The same single street light was flickering outside as they approached from the window on the opposite side of the store as before. Me, again. Wearing the same outfit, a 9 Inch Nails shirt with the Pretty Hate Machine album cover on it, leaning over the counter and inspecting the television in front of me. Except the television was now showing me watching myself on the tape. The small digital clock on the desk was visible from this angle, reflecting the time 8:49 p.m. I looked over at the clock, though my eyes were shut tight for a moment before willing myself to actually see what it said. 8:50 p.m. I practically pulled the phone off the damn counter, yanking the cord as I picked up the receiver and fell to the floor, hiding behind the low counter. Above me the television showed my actions in real time, like I was watching security footage from an outside view. I didn't even bother calling the cops, knowing it would be useless, instead punching in Dustin's number. "Hey, Dustin here. Can't come to the phone right now, but I'll return your call when I can. Thanks." Followed by the long, excruciating beep. I was babbling into the phone, nearly in tears by what I was seeing. Yeah, there was technology for live broadcasts in the 90s, but not going from a film camera to a goddamn VHS tape. There was nothing on the television, no receiver plugged in, no antennae. This thing was solely for watching the tape returns. The tape was still rolling, a loud whine coming from the VCR as it did. Then it cut to a new viewpoint, switching from the brightly lit shop interior to a completely dark area, the surroundings unintelligible from the dark, grainy quality. Suddenly the entire frame lit up, a pillar of luminous fire coming from the middle of the screen. As the flames grew, I could make out a human figure enshrouded in them, letting the flames completely engulf them before the screaming began. Deep, hideous bellows as their skin began to bubble, all in one, static shot to see their horror. 911, what's your emergency? I didn't even realize I'd dialed the number, phone to my ear with the dial pad on the ground next to me. Hello? What's your emergency? I couldn't even speak. The VHS player began to whine, tape speeding up as the person on screen began to burn more fiercely, finally collapsing from standing to kneeling on the ground as their screams began to weaken. I heard the film get loose from the tape wheels inside, a mass of magnetic ribbons bursting forth from the machine as smoke rose from it. Even unplugging it didn't stop the motor from running. As the screams faded on screen, the image began to burn out from the destroyed tape, distorting and terrifying static on the television in front of me. By the time I came back to my senses, the operator was giving me a spiel about how false emergency calls were illegal. I finally found my damn voice, telling them I needed help down at Cal's, my voice shaking the entire time. Know what the bastard said? "Sir, we've had calls coming from Cal's every weekend. This is the 4th one tonight alone. We're done responding to these jokes," the operator said. "The fuck do you mean 4th time?" I was yelling now, prompting the operator to start getting angrier with me. This is the first time I've called. Someone is out there watching me. Well, that's what your friends told us earlier too, but when our officers drove by there wasn't anyone out there. She responded, a no-nonsense tone coming in now. Now, if you keep calling in these fake emergencies, we can take legal action. Jesus, fuck you, I said, slamming the receiver down. There was no telling if whatever left the tape was still out there. Dustin wasn't answering, the cops couldn't be fucking bothered to actually help people, and I'm stuck here in the middle of a dark street with no protection. Unable to get anyone out there, not willing to walk outside and risk whatever the fuck might happen, I stayed right there on the floor. The only thing that got me up was to rush over and lock every door in the shop, hoping to God that whatever was there didn't already get in. Finally, a few hours later around midnight, the phone began to ring again. I grabbed it fast, almost falling over the counter trying to answer. Please tell me it's you, Dustin, I said, pulling the receiver to my ear. The only response was a cackle before the line went dead. So, needless to say, that shook me even further. I finally stood in front of the door for a few minutes, hyping myself up to make the run to my car and get the hell out of there. Full-blown panic was taking hold at this point, with a hyperventilating, shaking panic attack just around the corner waiting for me. Assuming whatever was out there didn't take hold first. I hit the door hard, not even bothering to lock it behind me as I rushed out and made a beeline for my car. My stupid key fob wasn't working, battery dead, so I was fumbling to get my key in the lock and get the hell into this crappy Pinto I saved money all last year for. Nearly tore the damn door off once the lock turned, ripping it open and diving in, desperately hitting the locks down as soon as I was inside. Before I could check anything, the engine was cranked and my tires were squealing on the pavement to leave. The exit to the parking lot was blocked. One single figure standing right in the middle of the entrance from the road, dark shadows engulfing them even with my headlights hitting them directly. This thing was pitch black, like a void that all light around it was being sucked into. Before I could think about the possibility of it being a prank or some hallucination my tired mind was playing on me, I hit the gas, ramming full speed through the thing like it wasn't even there and turning onto the street. I swear to God, my car didn't hit anything, but I swear I saw this thing standing right where my passenger seat was as I passed through it. It just stayed there, and as I drove off into the night, tears beginning to stream down my eyes in fear, it just turned to watch me leave like nothing had happened. When I got home, I dashed inside and locked myself in my room. Mom was a little worried, but then just wrote it off as weird teenager shit. Think she assumed I was smoking pot and didn't want her finding out. This woman was keeping the satanic panic alive well into the 2000s, so she always assumed the worst. Dustin finally called me the next day, and I didn't even leave my room to try going to school. When I told him what happened, it was like a weight lifting to know that someone finally believed me. When he went in next, he insisted to Pete, the manager at the time who would later get fired for the Homeward Bound tape, that we needed 2 people on closing shifts from now on. Considering Pete was getting a load of complaints about calls from the police station, he was reluctant at best. Dude wouldn't give in though, insisting that we didn't have the hours for 2 closers. After seeing how much we were raking in, that was definitely bullshit, but whatever. Dustin and I made our own system, then when one of us would be closing, the other would show up when the sun went down to hang around. It worked, for a couple of months,